Hello class, welcome to lecture number 2, otherwise known as journal number 2. Today we're going to be talking about sports heroes, and I like to think that most of us kind of recognize the idea of sports heroes. But what I'm going to try to do is kind of discuss like the advent of the very first true sports heroes, how American history kind of coincided with sports history to give us what we now know. But I need to kind of start off to tell you who sports heroes were up until the turn of the 20th century. Americans gravitated towards the idea of heroic individuals, and most of the time it was heroic men. So for example, in the 19th century, clearly one of the greatest heroes of that era, it was George Washington, then later Andrew Jackson, and then after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, and other of the great generals. So the general idea that Americans had in the 19th century was war heroes, politicians, presidents were like the top tier heroes in American culture. Now, they were also followed by scientists, men like Darwin, men like Edison in the 19th century. But women who contributed to the war effort, nursing, women's rights of the 19th century, they were considered heroines as well. But it's important to know that in the late 19th and even up to the early 20th century, people gravitated towards believing that their heroes were their politicians, were their generals, and were scientists. So it wouldn't be unheard of to name your child, George Washington Smith or Andrew Jackson Thomas, for example. This was not uncommon. And in many respects, you had that going on. Some of the wealthiest men of the late 19th century were named after George Washington, were named after Andrew Jackson, statesmen that led the country in one way, shape, or form. And this was important. But what I need to kind of begin to discuss is that how everything changed by the 1920s. By the 1920s, America went through what I like to think is the very first transformative experience, which was World War I. Up until World War I, from 1917 to 1918, and even the year after, Americans really didn't have a big sense of modernization, but the war forced Americans to fully implement the idea of modernization. It brought in a new sense of efficiency. It brought in a new sense of government regulation. It brought in a new sense of media and mass consumerism. And by 1920, Americans were anxious because of what had happened, not only in terms of the loss of life in the war, but in 1919, the great worldwide flu epidemic, this pandemic that wiped out millions of people across the globe. Americans were despondent, Americans were downtrodden, Americans were generally just demoralized by the world around them. And you couple that also tied into a period of approximately 20 years where Americans sacrificed. This was a period of reform where they tried to become part of this progressive movement where the whole idea was to try to improve one's life, to improve the lives of others. So what you have by 1920, Americans were frankly tired of sacrifice, of despondency. They were tired of the negativity. So in 1920, Americans were urged to try to return to a sense of normalcy. So that, coupled with the new media transformation and the modernization of the media, all of this kind of coincides to this elevation of sports and sports figures to a new echelon that Americans just completely ate up in the 1920s. And there's 3 reasons for this, I believe. The first reason is, of course, the media. The media was transformed after World War I. I mean, for example, you have radio. prior to the First World War, no one really gravitated towards radio, but by the 1920s, you have radio in most people's homes. The very first sports broadcast was 1921. It was a boxing match, but nevertheless, it was fascinating to live in East Texas and listen to like this boxing match in New York City and get to follow it play by play. You know, the following year, you get to hear baseball games, and this was fascinating. But the media didn't just stop with radio. Magazines, newspapers continued this avalanche of publicity, obviously positive publicity like we discussed last lecture. But even more significant than that, what you have developing by the 1920s is the power of film. I know, it's not like what we know now on social media, on Twitter, on television, but you had newsreels. You had silent films that for the first time you could conceptualize and see some of the action that was taking place. And Americans just ate this up. Because for the first time, the media was taking a full-blown effort to not only conceptualize the news of the day, you know, the ideas of tomorrow, but also give people something to relax, which was sports. And people ate it up. People loved this idea. Now, touching on this is the second reason why sports grew so significantly. And that is the 1920s, because of some of the reasons that I just mentioned, you know, the progressive movement, the idea of sacrifice, the 1920s is also a period of mass consumerism. The war brought out restrictions in what you could eat, what you could use, what you could purchase. But the 1920s is a full-blown, you buy whatever you want. People bought in abundance. People bought on credit, even though they couldn't afford it. You know what's happening in the next decade, you know, the Great Depression. But even though you couldn't afford it, you could buy whatever you wanted. The choice was immeasurable compared to past generations. Grocery stores, advertising, the new automobile was now available for purchase. You know, you could buy a new automobile on credit for around approximately $500, which was about a year's salary. So this was amazing that mass consumerism, mass consumption in the 1920s leads to Americans just kind of gravitating towards sports. They're willing to pay the admissions fees. They're willing to kind of subscribe to whatever commercials are being sold so they can listen to the game, and they're being influenced to think about sports like something that they can't live without. Which leads us to our third reason, which is popular culture. You now know popular culture for a variety of different ways. I mean, you know it from social media, you know it from television, you know it from film. But at this point in American history, in the 1920s, this is the first time that Americans and the American public are living and loving alternate realities. You are breaking form with like the 6-day-a-week work schedule that most Americans had up to this point. And you're giving people this idea of an alternate reality where you could imagine yourself hitting a home run, where you could imagine yourself, you know, playing a football game, where you could imagine yourself in a prize-fighting match for the World Championship of the world. And Americans kind of leaned into like this idea of increased fame and increased adulation. So the 1920s, you begin to strip away like that level of bureaucracy, and instead you catapult the idea that individuals and individualism could be like the dominant trend in pop culture. So this is not just sports, but you have the very first Miss America pageant in 1922. You have silent film stars like Charlie Chaplin, trying to elude police officers and, basically getting his way. You have America's very first sex symbol, Rudolph Valentino. So this is not just found in sports, but it's found in terms of like movies and success and the blockbusters of that era. So for these three reasons, Americans just begin to kind of open their eyes and look at the world around them in a different way. And what they began to gravitate towards during this period of mass consumption is that the salesmanship and the commercialization that was found there, it just elevated sports heroes to a completely different level. And probably one of the greatest, arguably most controversial sports figures was the boxer Jack Johnson. I mean, an African-American prize fighter in a day and an age which was considered like one of the darkest periods of African-American life, going against stereotypes. I mean, you have African-Americans celebrating Johnson's exploits, his wins in newspapers. He became the subject of songs. His name was sung in the streets because this was like contrary to the country's, racial order. And Johnson kind of fanned the flames, of like what social mores were supposed to be at this time. I mean, for example, here was a black man who had married multiple white women, who was flamboyant, who was taunting his opponents in the boxing ring. And it came to a point where even black leaders and white leaders were both nervous about what Johnson's popularity could mean to their respective communities. And ultimately, in 1912, when he was found guilty of the Mann Act for transporting white women across state lines, he fled the country for several years before he came back to serve his prison sentence. But he was one of the most popular sports figures because it brought controversy. It brought this idea of notoriety that no one was accustomed to before. But probably the biggest sports hero of the 1920s, after Johnson, was Babe Ruth. Don't even get me started. We talked about baseball the last time, but I think Babe Ruth is extraordinary. He's made it into like modern films. His images, his ghosts, the adulation, but he was extraordinary for his time period. He transcended the world of the ordinary people, the ordinary Americans. He had gross behavior in the 1920s. He drank beer, he swore, he ate. He basically showed that he was not above having sex with different women. This was contrary to like the very, moralistic views of the time period. And what he was an amazing success story. Here's someone who came from a hardscrabble origin, as your book describes. And from 1918 to 1934, he led the league with over 40 home runs a season. That's extraordinary. His salary was something that men coveted. It was anywhere between 1.25 to 1.5 million. And endorsements through that well over 3 million a year. And I know, in the modern context, college football players probably earn more than that. But it's significant. It's significant in the sense that this is what Americans clamored for, what they desired. And Babe Ruth might have been head and shoulders above everyone else, but there's other heroes too. Jack Dempsey, the golden age of prize fighting, the golden age of boxing. Boxing transformed into like an everyday person's belief system in the sporting world after World War I. Rural America gave up prize fighting as it made its way into arenas and into the cities and into the radio and obviously newspapers of every major American urban area. And part of this was done due to promotion. A gentleman by the name of Tex Ricard, Tex, he was the king of sports promoters. And what he'd do is he knew kind of how to fan rivalries and how to frame, like controversy. I mean, he juggled all sorts of interests to get more people tuned in to a boxing match than was ever thought possible. So what we know is that he was one of the first ones to claim that this was going to be the fight of the century. And this is in the 1920s. The century is only like 2 decades old, but that term, which is still in use today, was coined by Tex Rickard. And even though men dominate the landscape of sports heroes, women are not completely shut out, but in a different capacity. For example, Helen Wills, she was known as the, quote, the American girl. In the fall of 1922, she was only 16 years old when, as a tennis prodigy, she made it into the finals of the National Women's Singles Tournament. I mean, it's now regarded as the US Open, but when she won the national title the following year, 1923, she was deemed as Queen Helen. And what people began to recognize that this was a different type of hero because she grew up in California. The climate was perfect for tennis. Tennis was a perfect spectator sport, so people could kind of relate to it more because, anyone could sort of play tennis. So she was very talented, and she was blessed with movie star looks, a combination that made her really wealthy and very powerful in regards to endorsements. So what it began to show, and again, this is the decade of the very first Miss America pageant. So on the one hand, Helen Wills had conventional femininity. I mean, she was conventional, she was beautiful, but she also kind of combined that with a certain masculine quality of sports. I mean, she hit hard and she was dominant in her sport. So clearly there was another reason why, someone was able to kind of catapult themselves to like this upper reach of sports heroes during this day and age. But sometimes people would come into the outer perimeter of what is considered sports and recreation, like the famous Charles Lindbergh. I mean, the 1920s was also the decade of feats. You could do a feat of strength, a feat of speed, some sort of feat where you could accomplish something. And what he did is he flew across the Atlantic Ocean in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. And here you had, this feat of great accomplishment that gained him a ticker tape parade when he returned. And even though he is not truly a sports hero, it seemed to kind of touch the pulse of like what the media, popular culture, and mass consumption kind of leaned into during this time. So it is certainly a planned effort to kind of get these individuals to endorse products, to draw audiences in, to draw spectators in. So what we are beginning to see is this development in the sports world of like a concerted effort to kind of see what audiences want and embellish on that for consumerism, for consumption. And I think that nothing exemplifies this more than mascots, believe it or not. And Texas has, I believe, the perfect conduit of kind of showing you like how mascots and how the idea of publicity and consumerism work. Like, for example, Texas's identity was Southern once upon a time. I mean, Texas fought in the Civil War. In the 19-teens and in the 1920s, Texas considered itself part of the South in many respects. Jim Crow laws, Plessy versus Ferguson, the idea of separate but equal all applied to Texas. But in 1936, that's the centennial for Texas independence, Texas decided to kind of change its identity from that of a southern state which had plantation origins, which had origins in the Civil War, which had origins in terms of slavery, to something uniquely different. Texas after 1936 became Southwestern. Something just like its history. It was a republic before it was a state. It was a nation before it was part of the Union. Well, it also applied to its sports mascots. I mean, by the time professional leagues came to the Lone Star State, you have a concerted effort to try to conceptualize this identity. For example, many of you may not know that Houston's professional baseball team from the late 19th century to 1961 were known as the Houston Buffaloes. The Buffaloes. I mean, there's a Buffalo Bayou in Houston, those of you that are from or familiar with that area. By 1962, they became the Colt 45s, like two Colt 45 handguns kind of crisscross one another. And the reason why? Because they said, no gun was more instrumental, no weapon was more instrumental in the opening of the West than the Colt 45. Western. The Dallas Texans became the Dallas Cowboys. But then, in the 1970s, when Texas saw another change, it became more modern. NASA came to Texas. The oil industry, was also part of the lexicon for Texas. Houston began to change its mascots. With the building of the Astrodome, the Houston Colt 45s became the Houston Astros. With the inception of their football team, they became the Houston Oilers. That's before they were the Texans. And then when professional basketball came, they were the Rockets. So in some respects, you have a combination of Texas being unique. Every other professional sports mascot, whether they're the Spurs, the Cowboys, the Mavericks, the Stars, it's something unique. It's something about the Southwestern, if not Western heritage. Houston was the example because it was modern. It was a space city. Rockets, Astros, Oilers, and then eventually the Houston Texans when they got their franchise back in 2002. So efforts to create identities also became a landmark effort by not so much teams, but by promoters, people that knew that sports and money and spectators all work together in a perfect synergy. And that's what I want to leave you with in terms of looking at how sports heroes began to develop and mascots began to develop. At the root of all of this was the fan, but not so much in terms of this blind loyalty to the fan, but the way that fans could contribute money in terms of being an audience and being a good consumer of those products. And that's what I want to leave you with, something to kind of think about, whether you may agree or not. We'll touch base again soon. Thanks, folks.